Part 2, South America. Where the soul has time to breathe. I never meant for it to become a pilgrimage. At first, I was just running, from the weight of the apartment, the stillness of our bed, the mug she'd left on the counter with lipstick still clinging to the rim. Running felt easier than staying. But somewhere between Washington D.C. and Boulder, something shifted. This wasn't escape anymore. It was devotion. I left Brooklyn with nothing but a backpack, a notebook, and Elizabeth's compass around my neck. Her last words had been soft, barely breath, but they'd settled in me like a vow. Take me everywhere. So I did. In D.C., I met Marcus, a man whose life had crumbled after his wife walked out without warning. He turned that heartbreak into a company called Threadline, a space for creators who, like him, had something broken to say. He told me I wasn't good enough for her. So I became good enough for myself. I think about that a lot, especially at night. Then came Philadelphia, where I stumbled into a bar and found Deshaun singing songs that sounded like quiet confessions. A former touring musician who gave up the spotlight to help anxious kids find their voice. He taught me what it meant to play quieter, not less passionately, just more honestly. He didn't say much about my grief, but somehow he saw it. Maybe because he'd been there too. In Boulder, I found silence, and a man named Tenzin who spoke in stories, not answers. He ran a retreat center tucked into the arms of the mountains. No clocks, no mirrors, just time. One night, under a sky full of stars and stillness, I asked him how to know when it was time to keep going. He said, "When your silence becomes love. That is when you walk again." I walked. And as I walked, I remembered, not just her dying, but her living. Her laugh on the rooftop, her poetry scribbled into coffee rings, the way she danced in laundromats and argued about grammar like it mattered to the universe. Each memory didn't drag me down anymore. They lit the way forward. But I know I'm not done. Elizabeth and I used to pin places to maps. Some we dreamed of. Some she just whispered about while watching the rain. She wanted to see Kyoto in spring, sketch the cliffs of Santa Fe, dance barefoot in Lisbon. We didn't get that chance together. So now, I carry her there. In stories. In steps. I've left the US behind. South America is calling now, wild, ancient, breathing in a rhythm I don't yet understand. This part of the journey feels different. Quieter. Not because the pain is gone, but because I'm learning how to carry it better. I've circled places in my journal. Cusco, Peru, where I hope to find stillness in stone streets and maybe sit in a café that smells like bread and firelight. Sala de Uyuni, Bolivia, where the sky meets the earth and you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Maybe I'll feel her there. Maybe she already is. Sao Paulo, Brazil, for the music, the movement, for the dancers she once admired but never met. And then Patagonia, at the very bottom of the world. Where the silence isn't empty, it's full. I don't know what I'll find in these places. Maybe just strangers who remind me of something true. Maybe a piece of myself I haven't met yet. But I'll keep listening. I'll keep writing. I'll keep walking. She asked me to take her everywhere. And I will. Cusco, Peru, a mountainside cafe and the smoke of memories. The air in Cusco felt like a dare. Thinner than I expected, clearer too. As if the sky was daring me to breathe differently. I arrived just before dusk, the light already bending gold around the edges of the mountains. The streets wound up and around each other like threads in an old story, stone upon stone, uneven and humming with memory. It smelled like wood smoke, roasted corn, diesel, rain. A smell that said, "You're not in the center of the world anymore, but you're somewhere important." I didn't have a plan. Just the name of a neighborhood, San Blas, and a screenshot of a guest house with green shutters and a slanted roof. I dropped my bag, drank the coca tea the owner handed me like a ritual, and tried to ignore the thudding in my head from the altitude. She told me to rest. Instead, I walked. I followed the sound of a flute I couldn't see, past murals of jaguars and saints, past market stalls shutting for the evening, until I saw the sign. La Luz Suave, the gentle light. The lettering was faded. The wood cracked. But the windows glowed with a kind of warmth that tugged at something deep in my chest. Inside, there were only 4 tables. A fireplace in the corner, books stacked sideways on narrow shelves, a string of bulbs above the counter that blinked like they couldn't quite believe in electricity. That's when I saw her, Camila. She was behind the bar, elbow deep in dough, hair wrapped in a scarf the color of turmeric. Her sleeves were pushed up, revealing a mess of tattoos, flowers, birds, a line of script in what looked like Quechua. She moved with the ease of someone who had made peace with being still. She looked up, clocked me immediately for what I was, lost, tired, carrying something heavier than my backpack. "Altitude?" she asked, brushing flour from her hands. "Yeah," I croaked. "Among other things." She poured a cup of herbal tea, mint and coca and something sweet-smelling I couldn't name, and set it in front of me like a prescription. "This will help," she said. "Or at least, it won't hurt." I stayed. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. My legs didn't want to walk anymore. My grief had settled into my lungs the way it sometimes did, quiet but suffocating. I took the table by the window and tried to write, but everything I wrote felt brittle. So I drew instead. A compass. The one Elizabeth used to wear, the one I now kept on a chain beneath my shirt. Camila passed by and caught a glimpse. "Yours?" she asked gently. "It belonged to someone I lost." She didn't ask anything else. Just returned 10 minutes later with a slice of something warm and golden. "My grandmother's cake," she said. "Almond. Orange peel. A bit of cinnamon. She used to say grief should always have something sweet beside it." That's how it began. The next day, I came back. I didn't mean to make it a ritual, but sometimes the body finds its own temples before the mind can protest. Every morning, I climbed the hill. Every afternoon, I wrote in the same corner. And slowly, Camila began to speak. Not in full stories. Not at first. Just fragments. She told me she'd grown up in Cusco. That she'd left for Lima when she was 18. That she'd returned only after. Everything fell apart. One day, while I was flipping through a book on the café's shelf, Poemas Humanos by Cesar Vallejo, she came and sat across from me. "Do you want to know why I built this place?" she asked. I nodded. She looked at the fireplace. The ashes from the night before were still soft and gray. "Because my brother burned everything else." His name was Joaquin. Older by 4 years. She used to say he carried joy like a second skin. He taught her to make music with bottles, to climb walls that weren't meant to be climbed, to whistle like a bird and lie like a poet. He was her world. They both left for Lima, him to study architecture, her to bartend and paint and waste time beautifully. Their parents had died young. There was no one waiting for them back home. So they leaned on each other like two halves of a single pillar. But Joaquin, he fell hard into something he couldn't climb out of. Camila never said the word addiction. But she didn't need to. "It started with pills," she said one night as we sipped tea by the fire. "Then something stronger. Then it became everything. Every conversation. Every plan. Every silence." She tried to save him. Of course she did. She said it like an apology, not a brag. She told me about hospital visits, about arguments in doorways, about the times she found him asleep on their roof, holding a plastic toy from a vending machine like it was a relic. "I thought," she said, "if I just loved him enough, he'd come back." But he didn't. Not when she begged. Not when she threatened. Not even when she gave up. One December, she went to work her usual shift at a bar in Miraflores. When she came home, the apartment was gone. Not empty, gone. Fire trucks. Police tape. Neighbors in pajamas pointing at smoke still curling into the night sky. He'd fallen asleep with a lit cigarette. He survived. Barely. But everything else didn't. "I lost my paintings," she said. "My journals. Our childhood photos. Our mother's scarf. The last gift I ever got from my father. And I lost something else too," Any illusion that I could fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. She came back to Cusco 6 weeks later. And she built La Luz Suave with her own hands. She showed me the back room one afternoon. It was tiny. A bed, a desk, a window that framed the hills like a watercolor. On the desk, a photo of her and Joaquina's kids, covered in mud, laughing so hard their eyes were closed. "He died 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Not in fire. Not even from the drugs. He just didn't wake up one day. They said it was his heart. But I think it was something else. I think he got tired of trying to outrun himself." I didn't know what to say. So I said the truth. "Elizabeth died slow," I told her. "But the part of me that went with her, that disappeared fast." Camila nodded. And we sat there, in her little sanctuary of ash and flower and warmth, letting our silences meet in the middle. One night, just before I left Cusco, she invited me to stay past closing. We drank a bottle of red wine by the fireplace. She lit Palo Santo and played an old cassette tape of Joaquin playing guitar. It was scratchy, beautiful, cracked in all the right places. "Grief," she said, "is smoke. You can't hold it. You just live in it for a while. Let it sting. Let it rise. And eventually it leaves enough air for something else." Before I left, she handed me a napkin. On it, she'd written a single sentence. "Don't try to keep the fire. Keep the warmth." I left Cusco the next morning. Not because I was ready, but because the road was calling again. Salud de Uyuni, Bolivia, where the sky learns to laugh. I arrived in Uyuni on a bus that smelled like dust and mangoes, after 14 hours of winding roads, cracked windows, and a crying baby 2 rows behind me. The town itself was flat and faded, like someone had pressed pause on it a decade ago. But the salt flats, they didn't need introductions. Even from the town's edge, you could feel them waiting. White. Endless. Whispering. I checked into a cheap hostel run by a woman named Mirella who didn't ask questions, just handed me a room key and a tiny bar of soap. There was no hot water, but the sheets were clean. That night, I dreamt of mirrors that wouldn't break. In the morning, I wandered. I hadn't signed up for a tour or anything organized. I just walked to the edge of town where the guides parked their battered jeeps, hoping someone would take pity on a lost gringo with a camera older than his backpack. That's when I met Mateo. He was leaning against the turquoise Toyota Land Cruiser, boot propped up on the bumper, sunglasses too big for his face, sipping Coca-Cola out of a glass bottle. His shirt was loud, red with dancing skeletons, and he had a laugh that carried like it had somewhere to be. "You lost or just poetic?" he asked, grinning. "Both," I said. "Perfect. I like poets. They tip better." Mateo wasn't a guide by profession. He'd started out as a street performer, juggling in La Paz, miming in Sucre, doing stand-up in broken Spanish-English at hostels for food and tips. But after a while, he'd grown tired of sleeping on floors and eating expired granola bars. He bought a used Jeep with money his aunt had saved for his wedding. "No one wanted to marry me anyway," he said with a wink. And now he ran private tours to the salt flats, but only on days when he felt like it. "I work just enough to stay hungry," he said. "Otherwise life gets boring." He offered to take me out that afternoon. Said we'd catch the sunset. I told him I didn't have much money left. That I was traveling for reasons I couldn't fully explain, and that I still had to make it to Brazil, maybe Argentina, somehow Japan eventually. He studied me for a second, then shrugged. "You write?" he asked. "I try." "Good. You can pay me with words." The tour was not a tour. It was more like a road trip with a cousin you never knew you had, one who talked too much, stopped the car to take photos of llamas, and played cumbia remixes on a cassette tape that hissed like it had a grudge. We drove into the salt. It's hard to describe what that's like if you haven't been. Imagine standing on the surface of a frozen ocean made of glass and light. The ground is white, not just white, but echoing, like a blank page with secrets written in invisible ink. We walked barefoot for a while. The salt stung the cuts on my heel from Cusco's cobblestones. Mateo handed me a flask of something that made my throat burn and my limbs float. "You're too serious," he said. "You walk like you're apologizing to the earth." "I'm not used to laughing," I admitted. He raised an eyebrow. "That's a stupid reason." We waited for sunset in silence. The clouds melted into fire. The sky blushed. The reflection in the salt made it feel like we were standing in the middle of a dream that had forgotten how to end. Mateo sat cross-legged beside me, chewing coca leaves and humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Did you ever lose someone?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "My sister. She drowned when we were kids. We were racing. I won. For years I thought maybe that was the punishment." I looked at him. The bright shirt. The playful smirk. The constant jokes. "You don't seem like someone who carries that kind of weight," I said. He looked at the sky. Smiled, but not like before. "I carry it," he said. "I just don't let it break my spine. Some people wear grief like armor. Me? I dance with it." Then he stood up. And did exactly that, danced. Alone, barefoot, on a salt flat that stretched into forever. It was ridiculous and beautiful, and so unashamed that I laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in months. "See?" he shouted, spinning. "Now we're both ridiculous." Later that night, back at the hostel, he handed me a pen and a stack of old postcards. "Write stories," he said. "Little ones. About the salt. The stars. That cactus island we passed. I sell them to tourists. They think they're souvenirs. But they're spells. Memories they didn't have, but believed in anyway." And so I did. For 3 days, I wrote stories on napkins, receipts, postcard backs. Stories about couples who kissed on the roof of the world, about lost travelers who found themselves in the echo of silence, about a boy who tried to juggle salt and sky. Mateo sold every one of them for 10 Boliviano each. I made enough money to book a bus to Sao Paulo. Before I left, he walked me to the edge of town and pointed at the horizon. "You're still carrying her," he said. "Good. Just remember, she wouldn't want you to stop laughing." I nodded. My pocket full of coins. My heart full of lightness I didn't expect. He waved. Then shouted after me. "Don't forget, write about the llamas." And I did. But more than that, I wrote about him, the man who taught me that joy is not betrayal, and that sometimes, the world gives you a clown with a cassette tape to remind you how to live. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the dancer who finally stopped running. Some cities don't whisper when they greet you. Sao Paulo sings. Horns, feet, barking dogs, shouting vendors, the whoosh of motorcycles weaving between buses. It's a full-throated chorus from the moment you arrive. The heat hugs you like a friend who's missed you. It smells like fried dough and sugar, sweat and sea breeze, perfume and pavement. I loved it instantly. So would she. Elizabeth used to say cities like Sao Paulo were alive in too many languages to sit still. I thought of that as I stepped off the night bus from Bolivia, my body aching, my head pounding, my notebook filled with salt and laughter and half-finished postcards. I didn't have a plan again. I was running low on money, but I'd learned not to panic. Somehow, the next step always introduced itself. This time, her name was Ana Luisa. I found her in Villa Madalena, dancing barefoot in a courtyard behind a graffiti-covered café. The place had no sign, just music spilling into the street and the smell of passion fruit and beer. She moved like water, remembering how to be fire. Eyes closed. Hair like night in motion. She wore a faded green jumpsuit, one strap falling off her shoulder, and her skin glowed with the kind of sweat that belongs to joy, not exhaustion. She wasn't performing. Not really. Just dancing like the world had asked her to forgive it, and she hadn't decided yet. I sat on the edge of a planter and watched until the music stopped. She opened her eyes, saw me, and smiled like we'd already met in some other version of this moment. "You're staring," she said. Sorry, I replied. It's just, you look like freedom. She laughed. Not politely. Fully. No one's ever called me that before, she said. But I'll take it. We talked after that. Sat under a string of lights strung across the courtyard, drinking cold beer out of mismatched mugs. She asked what I was doing in Sao Paulo. Walking, I said. Listening. Trying not to drown. She nodded. Fair. She told me she taught movement therapy at a community center 3 blocks away. That she used to be on a dance company's touring roster, but quit 5 years ago and never looked back. That life made me forget my body belonged to me, she said. But she didn't tell me the whole story that night. Only later, when we trusted the silence between our words, did she share what she had once run from. His name was Joao. She met him when she was 21, at a rehearsal, of course. He wasn't a dancer. He did lighting design. Quiet. Kind. The kind of man who never touched without asking, who remembered the names of her childhood pets after only one story. They fell into each other with terrifying ease. Moved in together within months. Planned to start a little studio in Bahia where dancers and musicians could work in the same space. She had never loved anyone like that before. Which was exactly the problem. I panicked, she told me. We were so good. Too good. And I started counting all the ways it could go wrong. She picked a fight over something stupid. Left for a 2-week gig in Mexico and never came back. Changed her number. Blocked him. Told herself it was for the best. I thought leaving first meant I wouldn't be left, she said. Turns out, I still lost something. She spent the next 2 years drifting. Workshops. Gigs. Cities that blended together. She'd perform in places she couldn't remember the names of, sleep with people whose eyes she never learned, teach routines to students she'd forget the next morning. She smiled through all of it. Until one night, in Montevideo, someone played the wrong song during a warm-up, a soft, quiet piece Joao once loved, and she collapsed mid-stretch. Just sat on the floor and sobbed until the room cleared. It wasn't grief, she said. It was shame. Grief is when something's taken. Shame is when you drop it yourself. She came back to Sao Paulo the next week. Walked the city like a ghost for months. Then found the café courtyard, joined a street class by accident, and started dancing again. Not to perform. Just to breathe. She built her own movement group from there. Not for dancers, she told me, for survivors. Women who had fled things they didn't always name. Bodies learning how to trust themselves again. Laughter stitched into every lesson. I learned to forgive my feet first, she said. Then my heart followed. She let me stay with her for a few days. Tiny apartment. Plants everywhere. Her cat, Flor, hated me. But I cooked her pasta one night and read her Elizabeth's poems. She asked if I wanted to sit in on one of her sessions. I said yes. The community center was loud and cracked and perfect. 12 women in a circle. Scarves. Scar tissue. Smiles that took time to bloom. Anna led them through a warm-up that was more laughter than motion. Then came the music. Then came the tears. Then came the lightness. I didn't dance. Just watched. And for the first time, I understood something Tenzin had only hinted at in Boulder. Healing is not quiet for everyone. Some people heal in motion. Some people sing their forgiveness into their legs. Later, she handed me an envelope. For your trip, she said. The center pays me. I want to pay you. I shook my head. You're helping me in ways I can't explain. She smiled. Folded the envelope anyway. Pressed it into my hand. Take it, she whispered. And when you dance again, because you will, let it be for her and for you. I left Sao Paulo at dawn. She walked me to the metro station. We didn't say goodbye. Just hugged too long. Just breathed in each other's courage. Before I descended the stairs, she shouted after me. Don't fall in love with the next girl. I shouted back. Only if she dances. She laughed. The train arrived. I turned. And then I was gone. Patagonia, Argentina, the end of the world, the beginning of breath. I took a long, slow bus from Buenos Aires to Patagonia. 36 hours of cracked highways, crooked neck naps, empanadas wrapped in foil, and books half-read under flickering cabin lights. The landscape changed like moods, flat plains, twisted forests, distant mountains like sleeping animals. Every now and then, a cluster of sheep. A crooked fence. Sky. More sky than I'd ever seen. By the time I arrived in El Chaltén, I felt peeled. Like something had been scraped off me on the road down. The town itself was a scatter of houses at the foot of the mountains. Like someone had spilled civilization and just let it settle where it landed. There were no stoplights. No billboards. Just wind, stone, and sky. I had come here because Elizabeth once said she wanted to stand at the end of the world and breathe. She showed me photos once. Glaciers like sleeping gods. Lakes so blue they looked artificial. Clouds hanging low enough to touch. It's where everything ends, she said. And that's why it feels like a beginning. So I came. The hostel was called La Última Página, the last page. I took that as a sign. It was owned by an older couple, retired teachers who traded Buenos Aires traffic for mountain silence. They spoke softly, moved slowly, like people who'd earned their right to stillness. I stayed in a room with bunk beds and a small window that looked out onto a field of tall grass. Every morning, I could see it bend under the weight of wind. The second day, I met Santiago. He was sitting by the communal fire pit, rolling a cigarette with fingers stained green from yerba mate. Late 50s, maybe older. Wore layers like armor. He had a scar under his left eye and a voice like gravel warmed by sun. "You're too early for the season," he said when I sat down. I shrugged. "I don't know what season I'm in anymore." He grinned. "Ah, one of those journeys." We shared silence. He offered me mate. Bitter. Sharp. Honest. He told me he was a trekking guide. Used to lead groups up Monte Fitzroy, through Laguna de los Tres, across frozen rivers and over ridgelines that looked like the edge of the earth. Now he only took solo travelers. "People like you," he said. "The ones who don't ask to be saved." I asked how he knew I was one of them. "Because you haven't asked me a single question yet," he replied. We hiked the next morning. Just the two of us, packs on our backs, thermos of tea, and a silence that didn't feel heavy. Santiago didn't talk much, but when he did, it was like listening to the landscape itself. Sparse. Precise. "Most people think this place is empty," he said once, pointing out toward a field of nothing. "But they're just loud. They can't hear it speaking." We camped that night near a glacial lake, the water so clear it felt like a lie. I couldn't sleep. The stars were too many. The cold too honest. I sat outside the tent, wrapped in every layer I had, clutching the compass around my neck. Santiago came and sat beside me, wordless, then lit a small pipe and passed it over. "You carry her," he said after a while. I nodded. "She asked me to." "She also asked you to keep going?" "I am." "But you haven't let go yet." I turned. Letting go feels like betrayal. He looked at the mountains. So does holding on. The next day was harder. We climbed for hours. My legs burned. My breath caught in my chest. I kept hearing Elizabeth's voice, half encouragement, half memory. "You can stop," Santiago offered once. But I didn't. And when we reached the summit ridge, when the world opened up below and around and above us, when the sky felt so close I could almost remember her, I understood why I'd come. Not to finish anything, but to witness it. The wind was brutal up there. It pushed against my chest like grief used to. I closed my eyes, held the compass, whispered her name into the air. And for once, it didn't echo. It rested. Back in town, I stayed one more night at the hostel. Wrote pages. Drew mountains. Dreamed without waking in a room that smelled like wood and wool. Santiago left early the next morning, without goodbye. just a folded note under my thermos. The mountain does not remember your footsteps, but it holds your silence. I took that as enough. I don't think Elizabeth is waiting for me at the end of this road. I don't even think she's gone. I think she's here, woven into the quiet moments between motion and memory. And now, I feel ready to go further. Not away from her, but with her. Smoke, salt, and the sound of laughter. South America gave me space. Not just physical space. The vast sky of Bolivia, the endless salt of Uyuni, the silence of Patagonia that felt deeper than sleep, but something more essential. It gave me space inside myself. To feel. To remember. To laugh again without guilt. I arrived in this part of the world still holding grief like a sharp object. Now I carry it like a worn photograph, creased, yes, but full of color. In Cusco, I met Camila, who built a café from ashes and taught me that grief doesn't leave, it just learns how to sit beside you without setting the room on fire. She showed me how to hold memory without letting it hold me back. In Uyuni, Mateo made me laugh so hard I cried. He taught me that joy is not a betrayal of the dead. That sometimes the world gives you a fool in a skeleton shirt and a beat-up Jeep to remind you that living is a sacred kind of ridiculous. In Sao Paulo, Ana Luisa taught me how to move again, how to forgive yourself for running, and how to build something beautiful out of what's left. Her story wasn't about being left behind. It was about learning to stay. And in Patagonia, Santiago took me to the edge of the world and showed me what silence can become when it's no longer wrapped in fear. The mountains didn't answer my questions. They didn't need to. They simply stood. And that was enough. Each of these people gave me something I didn't know I needed. Not lessons. Not advice. Just presence. I'm still walking with Elizabeth. But now, I'm also walking with them. What comes next? There are still places she circled in her notebooks. Places she whispered about between sips of coffee. Places we promised to visit someday, when time was less cruel. And I'm going. Next up, Europe, memory in every stone. Lisbon, Portugal, for the start we never got. For father music and blue tiles. For our promise. Prague, Czech Republic, where bridges hold hands with the past. Killarney, Ireland, for moss-covered cathedrals and the memory of old faiths. Budapest, Hungary, to let the hot water soak through old aches. Berlin, Germany, where ghosts write in graffiti, and I'll read every wall. And then further. Kyoto, where silence becomes sacred. Hanoi, where the ocean forgets to be loud. Cairo, where time itself kneels. Lisbon again, maybe. One more time, just to say thank you. Maybe by the end of all this, I won't feel finished. But maybe I'll feel whole. Whole enough to live a second life, stitched with all the names and faces that helped carry me through the first. She asked me to take her everywhere. And I'm still going.